the Spirit in the form of a dove, confirm the certainty of the word. O Christ our God, who hast appeared and hast enlightened the world, glory be to thee.
It occurred to me, I need to text along and ask him where he is. He's supposed to be one of the presenters. You dropped something. Yeah, thank you.
I'm partway through a documentary called The Social Dilemma. Has anyone heard that? The guy who's one of the founders of online tech, talking about how it's this super sophisticated behavioral thing, getting people to just get incredibly addicted. Because the business model is, as long as you stay online, advertisers are willing to pay money. And the degree to which they're doing this is really evil. Because, and I'm bringing this up because through texting and messaging and all this kind of stuff like this, I didn't even realize all this stuff that goes on with, because I don't even know how to use things the way they are showing it. But they give this hypothetical, well, it's a dramatized thing of a young high school kid, and somebody texts him, and there's these guys in like the brain center going like, we need him to keep online, have, send an alert to one of his other friends, and they purposely did this thing where they're ping-ponging back and forth unnecessarily with, if you want to show a picture, you don't just show a picture, you tag a picture. And then this little 3-dot deal starts pumping away that, oh, someone's messaging me. And they do that on purpose so that so all of a sudden you see that and then you're glued to the phone.
Yeah, you're not done.
Yeah, it's not, the message isn't even there.
Well, another thing is the addictive quality of this screen viewing itself.
Yeah.
That's what was in that 4 arguments for the elimination of television. That's what he talked about.
Sorry for that aside, but just this thing about texting, you're using it in a very simple way, but
Well, technology is neutral,
Yeah.
spiritually neutral. It's how you use it, and if you use it to communicate like I just did,
but
I don't see a problem with it.
I recommend this documentary.
Yeah, oh, I've heard that, and I'm aware of
You
a lot of the social manipulation that goes on. But at the same time, there's technology that is beneficial to us. If we can make use of it in a good way, I don't see a problem with that. Otherwise, we'd be sitting here by candlelight, not by electric lights. We wouldn't have an electric furnace. Well, gas furnace anyway.
I think however it affects us, it's 100 times worse for kids.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the reason I bring that up.
Starting before their brains have even developed,
But
which
it's-
is all the way.
But it's also the things that I know everybody here probably never does anything like this, but the TikToking and Twitter and all this other stuff like that, it's like the social engagement of all these little mechanisms, because even this thing about doing selfies, they have filters to make you more handsome or pretty. And then it twists kids' heads where they're going like, oh, if I only looked like that in real life. And then there's still these like 12, 13, 14-year-old girls that want to get plastic surgery. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So let's get started.
Sorry.
Sure. I can start if you want.
And you are?
Theodosius of Chernigov.
That's what I thought. Let's hear his life.
All right.
Or at least in
So
a
I
bridge
printed
version.
off a picture of an icon. So Saint Theodosius of Chernigov was born in the early 1630s in the Podolsk governance. He was descended from a noble family of the Polonitsky Uglitskis.
That's what the last word is
Yeah.
from the
Uglitz,
Uglitch.
yeah. His parents were the priests Nikita and Maria. The saint was taught Christian piety in his parents' home, and this piety remained with him throughout his life. From childhood, he was distinguished by a fervent love of God and zeal for the church. The innate abilities of the youth came to light at Kiev's Theophany School at the Kiev Caves Lavra, the future theological academy. The school was flourishing at the end of the 1640s when its rectors were Archimandrite Innocent and Igumen Lazar, who later became Archbishop of Chernigov. Among its instructors were Hieromonk Epiphanius, Hieromonk Arsenius, Bishop Theodosius of Belarus, Igumen Theodosius, and Meletius Zeke. These were the enlightened men of those days. The comrades of St. Theodosius at the school would become future outstanding pastors. Simeon Polotsky, Ioannikas Golyatovsky, Anthony Radziwiłowski, and Varlam Yasninsky. The Kiev Theophany School was the chief center in the struggle of orthodoxy against the assaults of Catholic clergy, particularly the Jesuits. St. Theodosius grew to spiritual maturity near the relics of St. Anthony and Theodosius and other God-pleasers of the Kiev caves. And he tried to imitate their holy lives as much as he could. He devoted all his free time to prayer, meditation on God, and the reading of Holy Scripture. It might be surmised that the saint did not finish the full course of studies, since the school ceased its activity for several years following the devastation of Podolia by the Poles. All his life, the saint had deep regard for the Kiev Caves Lavra, where he was educated. In the Synodicon of the Kiev Vidubitsk Monastery is the following comment about St. Theodosius. He was a man of fine intellect and generous to the Kiev Brotherhood Monastery. Upon receiving his education, the future hierarch received monastic tonsure at the Kiev Caves Lavra with the name Theodosius in honor of St. Theodosius of the Caves. Metropolitan Dionysius of Kiev made him archdeacon of Kiev's Cathedral of the Hagia Sophia and then appointed him steward of the episcopal household. Soon he left Kiev and went to the distant Krupitsky Monastery near Baturina in the Chernigov diocese, which was famed for its strict monastic life. There he was ordained to the holy priesthood, but remained there only a short time. In 1662, St. Theodosius was appointed igumen of the Korsun Monastery in the Kiev diocese, and in the year 1664 he was made head of the ancient Kiev Vidubitsky Monastery. This monastery had fallen into the hands of the Uniates and Poles at the beginning of the 17th century and was in complete ruin. Thanks to the energy and initiative of St. Theodosius, the Vidubitsky Mikhailovsk Monastery was quickly restored. And actually, this will come up again, where several monasteries that were taken over by the Poles he helped restore. He was particularly concerned with the order of church services. He formed an excellent choir, which was famed not only in Little Russia, which is basically Ukraine, but also in Moscow. St. Theodosius sent his singers to Moscow in 1685 to instruct the choirs in the Kievan chant. As a strict ascetic himself, St. Theodosius was concerned with the spiritual growth of his monks. He founded a small skete on the island of Mikhailovskina, not far from the monastery, for brethren wishing to live in solitude. He appointed the hieromonk Job, one of the most zealous monks of his monastery, to organize and administer the skete. St. Theodosius had to live through some quite difficult days, enduring many sorrows. He and other igumens were accused by Bishop Methodius of Mstislav and Orshansk of betraying Russia in a supposed correspondence with the enemies of Russia. On September 20th, 1668, St. Methodius explained the matter, and on November 17th in 1668, so about a month later, the lie was exposed, and St. Theodosius, together with the other igumens, were vindicated. Archbishop Lazar esteemed the high spiritual qualities of St. Theodosius and befriended him. He called him a sheep of the flock of Christ, teaching by humility, and he prophetically expressed the wish that the name of St. Theodosius might be inscribed in heaven. When Archbishop Lazar became locum tenens of the Kiev's Metropolitan See in 1689, he appointed St. Theodosius as his vicar in Kiev, while he remained at Chernigov. In his capacity as vicar of the locum tenens of the Kiev Metropolitan See, St. Theodosius had an active role in many ecclesiastical events. In 1685, he participated with the right of a decisive vote in the election of the Bishop Gideon as Metropolitan of Kiev, and he was sent to Moscow with the news of this event with Igumen Jerome of Peroslavl. In Moscow, both representatives were received with honor and esteem. Indeed, the result of this delegation was the reuniting of the Kiev Metropolitan See with the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1688, St. Theodosius was appointed archimandrite of the Chernigov's Eletsky monastery, replacing the deceased archimandrite Ioannikis. In appointing St. Theodosius, Archbishop Lazar told him to spare no effort in placing the Eletsky monastery in good order. This monastery had not yet been set aright after the expulsion of the Jesuits and the Dominicans, and it was in great disorder. So I just put a note here for myself. Chernigov and the monastery had been taken over by the Poles during the time of troubles, which we talked about previously. And the Poles handed the monastery over to the Uniats in 1923.
1623.
Well, yes, I'm prescribing up. 1623, and they were expelled about 23 years later. And so this monastery, the Eletsky Uspensky monastery, was named after the Eletsky Chernigov icon of the Theotokos. The original was lost during the strife.
In the time of trouble.
In the time of troubles. This icon was a miraculous icon that appeared on a tree, basically. Through the efforts of St. Theodosius in his 2 or 3 years as igumen, the monastery's revenues and properties increased, the church of the Dormition was repaired, and a copy of the original Eletsky icon was enshrined there that worked miracles.
So the
Copy work miracles.
The copy
copy
worked
is
miracles.
working miracles.
Yeah. If I recall, I think the original showed up in 1030 or maybe 1130, one of those, something like that. In his new position, the saint also assisted Archbishop Lazar in many important matters. He participated in drafting a conciliar reply to Patriarch Joachim of Moscow in response to his questions about the attitude of the Kiev Metropolitan See to the Council of Florence, and its judgments on the question of the transformation of the holy gifts as accepted by this Florentine council. When the Patriarch proved to be unsatisfied by these answers, the Baturino igumen, St. Demetrius, the future Metropolitan of Rostov, was sent to him at the beginning of 1689. St. Theodosius journeyed with him as the representative of Archbishop Lazar. He was entrusted with the delivery of a letter to the Patriarch to clear up the misunderstandings. We also talked about the Council of Florence prior as well.
And this whole trip was
Yeah.
we covered when we talked about St. Demetri of Rostov.
Because of his poor health, Archbishop Lazar wished to see St. Theodosius consecrated to the episcopate, seeing in the saint a worthy successor to himself. On September 11th, 1692, the election of St. Theodosius at the Archbishop of Chernigov was confirmed, and he was consecrated in the Dormition Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin 2 days later. Archbishop Theodosius was given the right to serve in the Sakos, which at that time belonged exclusively to the patriarchs and metropolitans, which I found interesting. Little side note that in Russia that was the case until him.
So don't forget that point because we'll talk about it.
Yeah. Little information regarding St. Theodosius' administration at the Chernigov diocese has been preserved. The saint worked incessantly to raise the level of true Christian piety in his flock. He also focused on maintaining old monasteries and founding new communities. At the very beginning of his episcopate, the Pechenitsk convent was established with his blessing, and he himself consecrated the convent church in honor of the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos. In 1694, a skete was founded near Lubietsky. The same year, at the Dominsky Monastery, the saint consecrated a temple in the honor of the Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos. In the summer of 1695, he consecrated a majestic temple in honor of. So the lives in English that I saw all said this was an honor of the Theotokos, but all the Russian sources said that the monastery was to the Trinity. So just bring that up. It's a little confusing. So a majestic temple in honor of the Trinity on the summit of the Boldino mountain near the ancient monastery of Saint Elias. Under Saint Theodosius, there was a special enthusiasm for and strengthening of monasticism in the Chernigov diocese. The saint also devoted much attention to clergy, and he tried to choose worthy candidates for the priesthood. He also encouraged the pastoral education of the Chernigov clergy. He invited learned monks from Kiev, among whom was Saint John Maximovich, the future Metropolitan of Tobolsk, and also a helper and also a helper and successor of Saint Theodosius in organizing the Chernigov clergy school. Strict uprightness in regard to clergy and flock, deep compassion, and concern of Christian love and peace were distinguishing features in the activity of Saint Theodosius. Not only did the Orthodox turn to him for help and advice, but even persons of other confessions. Saint Theodosius did not remain with his Chernigov flock very long. Sensing the approach of death, he has summoned the administrator of the Bryansk-Svensk monastery, Saint John Maximovich, and appointed him archimandrite of the Chernigov-Aletsky monastery. Saint Theodosius died on February 5th, 1696, and was buried in Chernigov's St. Boris and Gleb Cathedral Church in a special crypt right near the Kleros.
Near the right Kleros.
Near the right Kleros, I'm sorry. His successor, St. John Maximovich, who was healed of a grievous illness by St. Theodosius, later placed a stone plaque over his grave with a poetic inscription in gratitude for the saint's help. The special grace with which St. Theodosius attained is shown by his ascetic life and his assistance to all who turn to him in prayer. After his death, the holy shepherd showed his abiding care for his flock through a large number of apparitions and miraculous cures. 76 years after his repose, the body of St. Theodosius was discovered to be incorrupt, and from that time his veneration spread throughout Russia. The glorification of St. Theodosius occurred on September 9th, 1896.
Okay. What was that point I told you to keep in mind?
The Sakos.
Okay, let's start with that. What's that about?
So the Sakos is the main, it is the robe that the bishop wears, or vestment that the bishop wears over his stikar.
Okay,
And it has a bunch
instead
of
of the
bells on it.
falon.
Instead of the falon.
What's the origin of it?
It is
Anybody?
It sounds ancient.
imperial.
It is the robe that the Byzantine emperors wore. And with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, the Patriarch of Constantinople was made ethnarch of the Christians in the Turkish Empire.
What is an ethnarch?
The ethnarch is the person who is in charge, who has rule over the people. So the Turks made the patriarch responsible for the Christian community. And there were a number of patriarchs who were executed because of one rebellion or another among the Christians. It was an easy way of making somebody responsible for them. So patriarchs started wearing the sakos. Now, apparently we're finding out when the sakos starts to be worn in Russia. Because what is it? What did you say?
So it was after his election to the episcopate in 1688, I think, is when it was. He was given
The right to wear the sakos.
1692. He was given the right to wear the sakos, which at that time in Russia
worn
was
only
exclusive to the patriarch, or two patriarchs and the metropolitans.
Okay. So
I
I'm
found
not-
this in the Russian sources.
yeah,
by
I'm
the way.
not sure exactly when the Russians picked up the sakos. It might have been with the Niconian reforms in the mid
Mhm.
17th century. I can tell you for a fact that the old believer bishops still wear the falon. And that's what the bishops were wearing throughout the world. And if you look at some icons of, say, St. Basil the Great or St. John Chrysostom, that's what you see them wearing. They wear the omophore over it, but it's a falon.
Is that the same thing you wear?
It's the same thing I wear. Now, if you look at this, look closely at his mitre. What's on top of the mitre?
On top?
On the top of the mitre,
Tiny little
Little
cross.
cross.
tiny little cross.
Only patriarchs with it? or?
Up until, I'm not, it's gotta be in the 2000s. I know it was when the roll corps switched to having all bishops wear a cross on top of their mitres after they submitted the Moscow Patriarchate. But the Moscow Patriarchate bishops did not wear crosses on the top of their mitres as late as 1990, and I'm not sure beyond that. Metropolitans and the Patriarch would have a cross on top of the mitre, and you see that in the roll corps. Metropolitan Filaret wore it, Metropolitan Vitali, Archbishop Anthony wore a mitre like mine. It has no cross on top. It has an icon on top. And archbishops and bishops only wore that. Now, I'm assuming that if he was given the right to wear the mitre, he's probably also given the right to wear the mitre with the cross. The Sakos, he was given the right to wear the mitre with the cross. Otherwise, this is a modern icon, and I don't think it is. Greek bishops wear, when they wear mitres at all, which is actually a fairly new development in the Old Calendar Greek Church, they always have a cross on top of the mitre. So, just a little bit of information about the episcopal vestments. I also wanted to ask, what's going on in the Ukraine when it's talking about, I mean, it's alluding to a whole bunch of stuff. The school ceased its activity for several years following the devastation of Podolia by the Poles. And a little bit later talks about how the Jesuits and the Latins had control of the monasteries, and stuff like that. What's going on?
Well, Russia's warring with the Poles.
Well,
And the unions
so
are coming.
like we talked about, the time of troubles is when the original dynasty or family,
Ruriki.
the Rurik dynasty ceased to be the Tsars. Ceased to be the Tsars, and so then there was a whole bunch of social and economic and just political trouble in Russia at the time. And yes, the Lithuanian Polish Union basically started warring.
They came in and conquered Ukraine.
Yeah.
Which is why you find a lot of Uniats still to this day in Western Ukraine.
What is the Union?
They follow the Byzantine ritual, the Orthodox ritual, but they are under the jurisdiction of the Pope of Rome.
So kind of like an Eastern Catholic Church?
Eastern Catholic
Exactly.
Church, that's what they are. Yes, and that comes from the time of the Union of Brest-Litovsk in 1596. Now, the time of troubles are over before his time. The time of troubles got resolved when the Romanovs ascended the throne.
Right.
But the Poles weren't kicked out of Ukraine for quite a bit later. And so throughout Ukraine, there's all this turmoil. The Uniats hold a lot of churches and monasteries, and the Poles are still fighting. The Russians and the Poles are fighting. The Poles didn't finally get kicked out entirely until Peter I.
Yep.
When he beat them.
Well, I also wanted to mention the Aletsky Monastery today is a convent for some reason. I wasn't quite. It's because during the communists, they shut it down,
Right.
and then it was reopened in the 90s. It reopened as a
reopened.
convent
Yes.
rather than as a male monastery.
That happens.
Yeah.
Um,
I just thought it was interesting.
Another thing you mentioned was that he and other abbots were accused by Bishop Methodius of Mstislav and Orshansk of betraying Russia by having correspondence with the enemies of Russia. What's this talking about?
Somebody accused them of writing some,
To whom would they be accused of
the
writing?
enemies of Russia.
Who would that
Supposed to
be?
The Poles.
The Poles.
Yeah.
Okay. These are clergy.
It's curious why they put it in veiled language. Why not just say,
I know.
I don't know,
Well, because the Poles are our friends now.
oh,
But I mean, if you think about Saint Theodosius, he's an abbot. These other abbots are abbots. They're clergymen.
Right, where are they?
What's the accusation? Is it a clerical or spiritual accusation?
No, it's political.
Has
It's
to
a
be
political
yeah.
accusation.
Well, and actually, if you later on, it was talking about how he would give, he would help those even non-Orthodox. Not only did the Orthodox turn to him for help and advice, but even persons of other confessions, and that's probably also related.
Okay.
Yeah.
But is
Yeah.
his helping out people of whatever
Right.
faith a political act on his part?
No.
not necessarily.
It's a Christian act.
Yep.
So it's interesting that the accusation is a political accusation. And what was the thrust of this? What was the intent of Bishop Methodi?
Well, to get rid of them,
Get rid of him.
Yeah, probably.
probably jealous or something.
Well,
Or who knows?
he's using political means to remove people,
Right.
presumably so he can
So
appoint
he can-
others.
Other thing.
And so then a little further on, Archbishop Lazar, who was his supporter, was Archbishop of Chernigov. But he becomes the locum tenens of the Kiev Metropolitan See, 1689. What's that talking about?
I'm not sure. I didn't actually look it up, but I would guess that it has to do with the taking over of
What is a
Ukraine.
locum tenens?
A temporary.
temporary head.
Well, sometimes it's someone in reserve. It's like if someone, because like, you know, the whole thing with Patriarch Tikhon, they set up locum tenens first.
Right.
It's
Why?
like if I get murdered or whatever,
Right.
You can put this person.
you can take my place.
Right. And in fact, that's exactly what they did.
Right.
The locum tenens rules, it's Latin, of course. Taking the place of is what it means.
Right.
Now, Archbishop Lazar was not, by that act, made a metropolitan. He was still archbishop, which means that the see of of Kiev is vacant.
Yeah.
Right.
And the locum tenens rules in the place during the vacancy of the see until such time as a new election can take place. But with the time of troubles, or not the time of troubles, with the troubles with the Poles, the election in Kiev is problematic. It's also interesting to note that a little further on, and it's at the end of this little discussion, it's talking about how Kiev was reunited with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, I wondered about
What
that.
was its status before that?
Probably union.
Probably.
No, it was Orthodox.
Well, it was probably separated because of the fighting amongst
Right.
the
Oh, I
Russians
see.
at
Yeah.
Moscow and the.
Not participating in this.
Lithuania.
So what happened
Yeah.
in the 16th century
Okay.
with the Brest-Litovsk Union? Patriarch of Constantinople separated the Kiev See from the rest of the Russian Orthodox Church because it was under the control of the Poles. And he made the Bishop of Kiev metropolitan, and he was responsible to Constantinople.
Hmm.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
cool.
It was 1620. Patriarch Kirill Lucarius established the rival metropolitan of
Okay,
Kiev.
a little bit later. Yes. And he was, Kirill Lucarius was a closet Calvinist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's some rather seedy people who've held the see in Constantinople. Of course, that's all under the control of the Turks. And what was their main concern about a patriarch of Constantinople?
Somebody they could control.
Exactly.
They can control to keep the Greeks
Keep the
controlled.
Greeks in
Yeah.
line.
And his orthodoxy was at best secondary, and if he had some errors, well, hey, no problem there.
As long as he's used
Yes. But by the end of the 17th century, Russia is on the rise. This is all during the time of what, 1680 something is the time at which Peter finally takes charge in Russia. He's, up until that point, he's a co-ruler with his brother, Theodore or Theodosius, I forget what the other brother's name was. And then he died, and so Peter's the sole ruler, and he takes charge in Russia, and he starts expanding. And so at that point, the Russians are able to take back Ukraine, at least as far as Kiev is concerned. Now, miracle working icons. Let's talk a little bit about them. What's a miracle working icon?
An icon which around miracles occur.
Very well put.
People.
Does the icon itself work miracles?
Yeah.
Why not?
It's
A piece of wood can't work miracles.
A piece of wood and some paint can't work miracles. That's well put too. So what is going on with these icons?
His grace of Mother God, or whatever.
Grace.
Ultimately, the grace of God
Grace of
Yeah.
God
working
through
through
the saints, that
the
were
saints
depicted
and
in
the images of, and we have another example. So I mean, basically a copy can work miracles just as well as the original.
Right.
Very often that's not the case. The original will be the miracle working icon. People make copies of it and they show veneration to it, but those other icons don't actually work miracles.
In recent times, I even know of two
Yes.
cases where paper
Yes.
was merged streaming.
Yes. I was going to point out that there is a, what was the icon? There's an icon in Michigan City, Indiana.
Yeah, that's St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas.
Yeah,
That was a copy.
it was a paper one. I got to venerate that in Washington.
Yeah. And it came around the ROCOR during the early years. Also the Brother Jose's icon was a copy of the Theodosius icon from Mount Athos, painted by one of the abbots on Mount Athos. I forget which one.
But it was a painted copy.
It was a painted
Painted
copy,
copy.
but it was a copy nonetheless, and so it was working there. So
And then
having,
the one of the John martyr, is that
Yes.
paper?
Yes.
It's all over Russia. It was incredible.
yes. So the point of a miracle working icon or a mercy reading icon or a weeping icon is to call the faithful to repentance and put their trust in God. Let's see. Now we hear of St. John Maximovich.
not.
Who is he?
That's not the St. John.
It is.
That we know.
It is the St. John
It's an
Maximovich
ancestor.
of
That's his answer.
Tobolsk.
Of Tobolsk, Metropolitan of Tobolsk. Who is he?
No?
Well,
He
he was
was
the
like-
enlightener of that area,
Right,
because it was the boonies.
right. Tobolsk is in Siberia.
Yeah,
And they were pagans out there still.
yeah.
And he was in the Kiev Caves Lavra. He was an associate and a helper of St. Theodosius. He actually succeeded in his Archbishop of Chernigov, and then he was sent as Metropolitan of Tobolsk. And this is all at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. So it's what, 200 years before his namesake. And as a matter of fact, our St. John Maximovich was tonsured John, because of St. John.
Because of St. John.
That Paul Wonski is answering. Correct, not a direct answer, but
But there's an ancestor.
he was an ancestor of the family. Maximovich is a Serbian name. And I'm not sure when the family came to Russia from Serbia, but they were there. You know, a lot of people came to Russia, Greeks, Germans, whatnot, because they could make a better living there. So he dies in 1696, but you said he was only glorified in 1896.
Well, as you mentioned previously, not many, very few, in fact, glorifications were made by the Holy Synod throughout the 19th century.
18th and 19th,
Yeah.
that's correct. But nevertheless, there's still veneration of him, and I mean, he was found to be incorrupt, and the veneration spread throughout Russia. Anything I missed that somebody wanted to raise a point about, or a question?
I'm just always amazed at all the stuff these people can do. I mean, all these monasteries, all this, I mean, it's amazing.
What do you mean all the stuff they can do?
Well, like fixing and restarting.
Yeah,
How many
productive
monasteries was it? Like 6 or
activity.
7? It just seems like, how
Well-
can you fit that into a lifetime?
Well, what did St. Theodosius do? And you'll see this with some of the other saints. I think that St. Joseph does. You'll see the same thing. How's he doing that?
Well, it sounds like he's a really good manager for one thing.
And what does that mean?
Means getting
Getting other
good
people to do
monastics in to help bring the quality
And
of,
you already mentioned that he had appointed one of his zealous
yeah,
monks to be in charge of a skeet
yeah.
that he was building, and he did the same thing with the others.
And then fundraising, of course, from various.
So how do you do
Patrons.
fundraising in Imperial Russia?
You go find the patrons in the area, the rich nobles and other things, and
And you go to the Tsar.
you go to the Tsar, yeah.
That's how you do it.
A lot of footwork.
A lot of footwork.
Mm-hmm.
And where was he consecrated bishop?
In Moscow.
Moscow.
In Moscow. Not in Chernigov, not in Kiev.
Right.
So he's making trips to the center of power. And you're right, he's also, I mean, we'll see in one of the other lives where the local
Yeah.
guy is supportive of it.
Well, in one of the Russian things I was reading about his life, it mentioned a specific patron of
Yeah.
the
Yep,
monastery. I just didn't bother to remember it.
right, that's fine.
And
Well, also, as a
I think it was a colonel or something.
person of holy life and so forth, he was able to have a degree of reliance on God and faith that
Well, let's not forget that the proximate cause might be a donation by a local nobleman or the Tsar or somebody. But
Well,
these
God's
people are
blessing.
only inspired to do that by the grace of God.
Right.
They could just as easily, and we also see other instances where they don't, and they
and
oppose.
by the holiness of the petitioner's life too.
Which-
I mean, he
Well,
inspires.
Which is
and
touching.
an inspiring example, and
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, let's
All right,
go on.
what?
You want to go next?
Okay. I believe the icon here,
You are absolutely right.
Yosh. St. Joseph, Bishop of Belgrade, was born at Poluca in the former Poltava governance on September 8, 1705, the feast of the Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos. He was descended from the old and venerable Little Russian or Ukrainian lineage of the Gorlenkovi. At baptism, he was named Yochanan. In 1712, his father enrolled the 7-year-old Yochanan in the Kiev Theological Academy. Within the walls of the academy, he felt attracted to monastic life. For 7 years, he studied it further and finally revealed his intention to his parents. For a long time, his mother and father pleaded with their firstborn son not to accept monastic tonsure. but in 1725, unknown to them, he became a Rasthophor, robe-wearing novice, with the name Hilarion at the Mezhigorsk Monastery in Kiev, and on 21 November 1727 was tonsured in the angelic schema with the name Yosef at the Kiev Bratsk Monastery. This event coincided with the completion of his studies at the Theological Academy. After the death of Bishop Barlam, the See of Kiev was governed by Archbishop Raphael Zaborowski. Archbishop Raphael noticed the abilities of the young ascetic and assigned him to greater service to the church. He was entrusted with the responsibility of the office of examiner of the Kiev Archbishopric. In November 1734, Archbishop Raphael ordained the hierodeacon Yosef as higher monk, and he was transferred from the Bratsk Monastery School to the Kiev Sophia Archbishop's house. At the same time, he was appointed a member of the Kiev Religious Consistory.
That just means the brotherhood.
Thank you. In fulfilling the office of examiner, he exerted much effort towards the correction of moral deficiencies among the parish clergy. The saint's service in the consistory office enabled him to develop his administrative abilities. During this time, he made a good study of the needs of clergy, noting both the good points and the failings of the diocese. His talent for administration was combined with his great spiritual effort. He quickly ascended the ladder of spiritual perfection, which can be seen in his work, The Conflict of the Seven Venerable Virtues with the Seven Deadly Sins. On June 24, 1737, hieromonk Joseph was appointed head of the Holy Transfiguration Magarsk Monastery and elevated to the rank of abbot. Here he worked with all his strength to put the monastery in good order, for it was an old bastion of orthodoxy in the struggle with the Unia. In this monastery were the relics of St. Athanasius, Patriarch of Constantinople and wonder worker of Lubni. Several times St. Athanasius appeared to Abbot Joseph as a sign of his patronal protection. In 1744, Metropolitan Raphael elevated Abbot Joseph to the dignity of Archimandrite. Towards the end of that same year, he was called to Moscow, and soon, at the direction of the Holy Synod, he was appointed vicar of the Holy Trinity Sergiev Lavra Monastery, the most important Russian monastery and the spiritual center of the Russian Orthodox Church. At this monastery of St. Sergius, he also unstintingly fulfilled obedience to the church, which required much exertion for the rebuilding of the monastery after a fire. On June 2nd, 1748, at the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in Petersburg, Archimandrite Joseph was ordained Bishop of Belgorod. Ascending the Archbishop's throne, St. Joseph strictly concerned himself with piety and the condition of the churches, with the proper celebration of divine services, and especially with the moral condition of his flock. The saint devoted a great attention to the education of the clergy and the correct observance of ecclesiastical norms and traditions. Just as before, the saint worked with all his strength in his pastoral service without regard for his health. The following events were a visible manifestation of God's favor. In 1754, St. Joseph made one of his frequent journeys to his bishopric. In the city of Izium, he paid great attention to the main church. Upon entering the church, he immediately looked with amazement at a large icon of the Mother of God standing in the corner of the narthex, behind which the altar boys shook out charcoal from the censer. Getting down on his knees before the icon, the saint exclaimed, "O heavenly Queen, forgive the negligence of thy unworthy servitors." And then turning to the eldest priest, he said, "Why is this icon not put in a better place? God's special grace rests upon this icon. It is a sign of the Holy Virgin's particular intercession for us here and for our entire country." Then St. Joseph ordered the icon to be placed in the left-hand choir and came daily to pray before it. And there was a special reason for this. When Saint Yosef was on the point of departing from Belgorod, he saw in his dream a certain church, and in it, on a pile of rubbish, an icon of the Mother of God. The icon shone with a radiant light, and a voice said, "Look at what the priests of this church have done with my image. My icon is intended to be a source of grace for the entire land, while they have thrown it on a pile of rubbish." Astounded by such a dream, St. Joseph examined each church in the course of his travels, checking whether it matched the one seen in his dream. And when he entered the above-mentioned church and saw the icon which he had seen in his dream, he ordered everything to be done as described above. The Theotokos did not delay in showing her favor. The icon, called Heskin, Mother of God, soon began to produce many miracles and attract many pilgrims from all over Russia. And a second story, while rectifying the various shortcomings in his diocese and punishing those who were truly to blame, St. Joseph at the same time attempted to lovingly cure human weaknesses. The Lord endowed him with the ability to see deep into the hearts of men, to which the following extraordinary case bears witness. While traveling through his diocese, St. Joseph noticed a very ancient priest, and learning that the latter was 130 years old and living with great difficulty, St. Joseph advised the priest to think back where there was some forgotten and unconfessed sin on his conscience, which bound him to such an unbearably long life. After pondering for a while, the old priest did remember a forgotten sin and told St. Joseph of how, in fear of an evil landowner, he had served 2 liturgies on the same day, despite having heard an unearthly voice say to him, "Stop, what are you doing? Do not dare, lest you suffer damnation." And the priest even compounded his sin by replying, "May you be damned yourself." Upon hearing this and realizing that the old priest had cursed the angel of the church, St. Joseph brought him to an awareness of the enormity of his sin, and then blessed him to serve a liturgy, during which the saint earnestly prayed on his knees. After the liturgy, the saint absolved the priest of all his sins, and immediately the old man began to weaken, and falling at the foot of the altar table, died peacefully. On the eve of the repose of St. Joseph, the saint forbade his cell attendant Stephen to aspire to the priesthood, and he predicted that if he did not obey him, he would meet with an untimely end. To another cell attendant, Basil, the saint indicated that he would be a deacon but would never become a priest, and later this prediction was fulfilled. He died on 10 December 1754 at the age of 49 at a village of Graveron. On 15 December, his body was taken from there to Belgorod and placed in his Holy Trinity Cathedral. Not until 28 February 1755 was the coffin transferred to a crypt in the cathedral, which had been made on Joseph's orders. Some years later, his body was found to be incorrupt. News of this spread, and the sick began to visit the coffin of Joseph, many reporting cures. The miraculous power of Joseph's relics became known throughout Russia, and every year more people came to Belgorod to seek their help. Joseph thus gained the veneration of a saint, and icons of him became popular. In 1883, the Holy Trinity Cathedral became a monastery cathedral, and a series of requests for Joseph's glorification began to be made. Finally, in 1910, Tsar Nicholas II asked the Holy Synod to glorify Joseph as a saint, which it agreed to do. On 4 September 1911, the glorification was celebrated in the Holy Trinity Cathedral, Belgorod, attended by more than 200,000 people, many of whom had come from all over the Russian Empire and beyond. Before the First World War, Joseph's relics were greatly venerated and were brought out for the curing of the sick, when big crowds came hoping for a miraculous cure. One who attended such an occasion wrote, "Now it is hard to imagine that sight. Thousands and thousands of sick, bent, crippled, possessed, and blind people stood and lay on both sides of the road, along which the saint's relics were to be carried. A substantial shrine made of silver was created in the Holy Trinity Cathedral. In the summer of 1914, when news came of the Austro-Hungarian monitor bombardment of the Serbian city of Belgrade, beginning on 29 July 1914, one landowner, Prince Obolensky, spoke stirringly to his peasantry of the need for war, and they reacted enthusiastically. He later learned that his hearers had understood it to mean the Belgorod, which held the relics of the recently glorified Joseph. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks removed St. Joseph's remains from his shrine in the cathedral at Belgorod, and for some 70 years, their whereabouts remained unknown. In 1927, the Holy Trinity Cathedral itself was demolished. In the late 1980s, the remains were discovered at the Museum of the History of Religion and Atheism of the Academy of Sciences in the USSR in Leningrad. And on 16 September 1991, they were solemnly returned to the new cathedral of the Transfiguration of our Lord in Belgorod, the occasion being marked by a service in which Patriarch Alexei II took part. The same year, Leningrad returned to its former name of St. Petersburg. The feast of the uncovering of the relics of St. Joseph, Bishop of Belgorod, is celebrated on September 4th and also on the 10th of December, which was the day of his death. And there's a picture here of the crowd lining the streets when his relics were being...
Yeah, the early 20th century glorifications had massive crowds. Seraphim Masarov, I think that the crowd was at least 300,000 people. It's just huge numbers because the people were buying them. Did you notice he had a very rapid advancement in the clergy. He's tonsured at 22, and he's ordained at 29. What's the canonical age specified for ordination to the priesthood? 30. Now that's not always observed. I myself was ordained at 28.
But
So
he went to the theological academy at the age of 7.
Seven.
And
Right.
by the time he was 14, he wanted to be a monk.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was, in fact, he was tonsured at Rassapor. Well, that would have been when he was 20. They did wait on him. We've seen in some of the other lives where some of the saints have been tonsured monks in their teens, at early age. So, let's see, what else was there to bring up? Oh yes, the thing you brought up. What is wrong with serving two liturgies on the same day?
It's against the rules.
Why? There's a very specific theological reason for it.
Well, I think the liturgy is centered around the resurrection, and there's only one resurrection
Yes.
on one day, so having two doesn't really make sense.
The unity in the church, the unity of the services, the unity of the faith. There's one faith. And so the canons specify on any given altar table, only one liturgy can be performed per day. The priest can only serve one liturgy. A set of vestments can only be used in one liturgy. The chalice set, what's used for the communion can only be used once on a day.
There's also a specific time issue for the priest is how could he possibly prepare for communion again on the same day?
Well, what you're talking about, I didn't realize, it's not just the priest can't, it can't be done. So in this temple here, there can only be one service. Father Jonah couldn't serve for one after you did.
Correct.
Because we don't have a second altar.
Now, how do they get around this in the Holy Land? specifically in the Holy Sepulchre.
Use different altars.
They place a board on top of the stone altar.
A different board for each liturgy?
That seems a bit.
Well, they also have to deal with the fact that the Latins have the right to serve in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as do the Copts. I think it's the Armenians as well. And Antimans can only be served on once. Anything that is used for the Eucharist can only be done once in a day. Now, how do Orthodox churches get around this limitation? So we have a church, and we need to have multiple liturgies,
Multiple altars.
multiple altars, multiple clergy,
Multiple sets of
Vestments.
vestments.
multiple gospels.
What's the source for this? Where'd you get this?
It was on the internet,
Behind you.
and I,
Oh, here we go.
yeah, I kind of like those two stories.
Those two stories.
Little stories like
Yeah,
that
picture.
stick with me, so I
Yeah.
inserted that into this.
There's another little story about this, that he was giving alms in secret to people who were in need, poor families. And he once sent a load of firewood to some widow, and she prayed to God to reveal the name of her benefactor, and she saw a vision of him, because he was sending these things through other people. Another time, the guy who he was using to send out these gifts was ill and couldn't do it, so he goes out just dressed as a beggar, and he delivers. And he comes back to the archbishop's house, and he gets beaten by the guard, who thinks he's a thief.
Oh dear.
And then when he saw the face finally in the light, then he was ashamed and afraid. In the morning, he was expecting to be punished, but St. Eusaph rewarded him for being watchful.
Good job, Guardian.
That was his job. Okay.
I was impressed that he was, how he died at 49. He did all that stuff in 49 years.
Right.
There was no TV or internet.
That's it.
No texting, none of that.
Texting.
No TikTok, nothing like that. What do you have? I want to get him in.
St. Macarius the Wonder Worker, abbot of Kaliazan. Here's a map. This is Moscow, and here's the monastery location.
So it's north.
Zanskaya, and that's the Volga right here. I thought that was kind of interesting to see.
What lake is that?
I don't know. And here's an icon of St. Macarius. St. Macarius of Kalyazin. In the world, Matthew was born 1400 in the village of Gribkovo, Kozino, near the city of Kashin, into the family of the boyar Basil Koza. From youth, he yearned for monasticism, but he married at the insistence of his parents. After a year, his parents died, and after 3 more years, his wife Elena reposed. Having nothing to bind him to his former life, Matthew became a monk at the Nikolaev Klobukov monastery, desiring solitude. He left the city monastery with the abbot's blessing, and he found a suitable place between 2 lakes, 18 versts from Kashin.
A verst is about 6/10 of a mile.
Here the monk raised a cross and founded a solitary wilderness monastery. The boyar Ivan Kolyaga, to whom the nearby lands belonged, began to fear that a monastery would grow up there and that monks would begin to cultivate the wastelands. The enemy of our salvation planted such spite and enmity in the boyar that he decided to kill the saint. Suddenly he was stricken with a grievous illness. Fear of death awakened repentance in the boyar. Ivan Kolyaga was carried to the saint and told him of his evil intent, asking for forgiveness. God forgive you, the humble ascetic replied, wishing to expiate his sin and to help the saint. The boyar gave his lands to the growing monastery. The monks built a temple dedicated to the Most Holy Trinity. Word of the boyar Kolyaga's conversion brought many people to the monk seeking salvation. Saint Macarius tonsured Kolyaga and named the monastery Kalyazan for him. It became necessary to choose an abbot. Saint Macarius was then 53 years of age, but he considered himself unworthy of this dignity, and he asked each of the older men coming to him to become the monastery's priest and abbot. Yielding to the common will, the saint was made abbot by Bishop Moses of Tver. The new abbot prepared for his first service at the altar of God with long solitary prayer, and then communed all the brethren with the holy mysteries. In the rank of abbot, Saint Macarius labored to guide the brethren. The monastery had 2 chalices, a diskos, and 2 plates fashioned by Saint Macarius on a lathe. He guided not only the monks but also lay people coming to the monastery, dealing with both the educated and the simple. Despite his noble origin and his position of abbot, the saint wore ragged, frayed, patched clothing. In his conduct and his way of life, Saint Macarius was so simple that the haughty heretic Vassian sneeringly called him the peasant of Kalyazan. The saint preferred to hear himself mocked rather than praised. He went to solitary places, delighted to be alone with nature, while wild animals, sensing his holiness, walked with him like sheep. They submitted to him and sometimes took food from him. The spiritual stature of Saint Macarius was close to the spiritual stature of Saint Paphnutius of Borov, May 1st, 1477. Not by chance did Saint Paphnutius' disciple, Saint Joseph of Volokolovsk, September 9th, 1515, visit Saint Macarius in 1478 and wrote down his impressions of him. When I arrived at this place, said Saint Macarius, 7 elders came with me from the monastery of Klobukov. They were so excellent in virtues, fasting, and monastic life that all the brethren came to them to receive instructions and benefit. They enlightened all and taught them for their benefit. They affirmed the virtuous life and censored those inclined to misconduct, and neither did they seek to do their own will. Though the humble abbot was silent about his own efforts, they were not hidden from Saint Joseph. Perceiving the holiness of the abbot, he counted him blessed and spoke about the life of the monastery. Such piety and decorum were in that monastery, where everything was done in harmony with the patristic and canopic traditions, that even the great elder Mitrophanes Voltsev was amazed. He had just come from Mount Athos, where he spent 9 years, and said to the brethren, "My efforts in my journey to the holy mountain were in vain, because one can find salvation in the Kalyazin monastery. Life here is similar to life in the Kenobetic monasteries of the holy mountain." From the moment St. Macarius settled in the wilderness, he did not abandon his strict rule because of old age. Even during his lifetime, the saint repeatedly healed the paralyzed and the demon-possessed. The saint reposed on March 17, 1483. At the time of his death, they found heavy chains on him, about which no one knew. The incorrupt relics of the saint were uncovered on May 26, 1521, when ditches were dug up for a new church. A council of 1547 established his local festival celebration. The successor of Bishop Moses, this is an asterisk note at the bottom, the successor of Bishop Moses was St. Macarius' brother, Bishop Gennadius Kozin. The nephew of St. Macarius, St. Paisius of Uglich, was also famed for his sanctity. The Kalyazin monastery had a collection of The sermons of St. Gregory the Theologian, which St. Macarius had copied in his own hand.
This is, of course, all before the printing press. So he goes to the monastery in the city where he's tonsured, but he doesn't stay there. Why not?
Seek perfection.
Isn't one of the monastic obediences to stay put?
Stability.
Stability. Mm-hmm. So why does the abbot bless him to go? He's not been there that long.
He probably perceived that he was ready for it, because a lot of people aren't.
Yeah, and what he was trying to do was not found a big monastery on somebody else's land.
Right.
I mean, this is 1400, early 1400s. He's an adult now at this point, so it's 1430 or whatever. It didn't give the exact date, but it's early 14th century, first half of it, or 15th century. And much of Russia, especially northern Russia, is still pretty unsettled. And I think it's in the Northern Thebiad. This is published by
Platina,
Platina. They talked about how Russia was actually colonized by the monks. They spread out into the wilderness, trying to find solitude.
Solitude.
People
People
they
came.
find it, and then people come after them.
Those pesky people.
Villages.
Well, St. Sergius of Rognesh did the same thing. He goes out into solitude. People come. He's getting too busy, so he goes out someplace else, and people follow him there. And he founded several monasteries that way. And they go throughout the north, and they head east. And we were talking just a few minutes ago about Tobolsk. The same thing happens in Siberia. These monks are walking all over the place, trying to find a solitary wilderness. Tell me what's going on with Ivan Kolyaga. He's a boyar. What's a boyar?
Who's it landowner?
Rich landowner.
Landowner, noble,
Yeah.
a warrior. There were the two boyars that Prince Dmitry Donskoy wanted back from St. Sergius to fight the Tartars. Is another example of that. What's going on with him?
Sounds like you listen to the evil one.
He doesn't want a monastery growing up there because they'll cultivate the wastelands.
Makes
Why does
hunting
he-
difficult.
Oh,
I know, it
I was
sounds
gonna
so
say, why
funny,
does he
weird,
want
you know?
wastelands, but for hunting and
He liked his solitude.
he likes his solitude.
Well, and also whatever he was doing out there he was doing it for himself.
Yeah,
Hey, what do they
These
mean by
monks are
waste-
not, they're gonna interrupt that.
right.
What do they mean by wastelands anyway?
Yeah, which,
Well, you asked about the lake. It's not the only one out there.
like
There's
swamps.
wetlands and whatnot. And so he wants to kill him.
Seems a bit drastic.
Kind of extreme.
But you see this in the lives of several of the righteous, where somebody intends evil and they want to kill him. And it doesn't say exactly, but I mean, it wouldn't be surprised if it said an angel came along and struck him down. But he was taken down with the illness, right?
Enough to make them scared of death.
Well, again, this is an age where people believed in the spiritual life, for good or for ill. And miserable as his life was, spiritual life was, Ivan Kolyaga believed in God and called him to repentance. And illness very often is the means to bring people to repentance and to confess these things, which is exactly what he did. So then what does he do?
So he donates land.
Yeah, it's not just the land that St. Macarius had taken, he gives basically the whole of his estate to the monastery and the monks, and he joins them, and basically then he proceeds to help develop that whole area with monastic settlements. Does anybody find it interesting that the monastery was named after him?
Yeah.
Why?
Was he a saint? He was just the benefactor.
Right. So why would,
Seems strange.
what's the risk of naming the monastery after him, and why was it done?
Risk? It just seemed like not quite appropriate. I don't know
Why?
if there's a risk to it because normally monasteries are, well, I guess they're named after places. not
Yeah.
after-
A lot of these, especially Russian monasteries, are
Named
named
after
after places.
places, not after saints.
Well, they're named after saints too, but they're named after places.
Yes.
I'm going to the Holy Trinity Monastery. Well, which Holy Trinity
Right.
Monastery you're going to go to?
Exactly right.
I'm going to the Nativity of the Theotokos Monastery.
Yeah. So,
And that's not just
So I'm not sure-
Russia. That's all over the
so
Orthodox
I'm
world.
not sure what the
Right.
risk would be.
Like, I'm going to Optina. They don't say, you know,
Right.
so was there a,
So what-
Alexander Optina?
I know. The
Yeah, I don't know.
so aren't the risks in naming the monastery after him both a risk of pride in Ivan Koliaga himself and envy in the other monks?
That's true.
Yeah, well, it doesn't say if he was alive or dead when they named it after him,
Right.
Yeah.
but.
Well-
That would be kind of very strange.
I mean,
Was it at the time he was alive
he,
and there?
I think he got humbled before that by the whole deciding to kill and being stricken with grievous illnesses and having been brought to the saint in the wilderness.
That's right. That's right.
So he was already humbled by that point. So
And it was sincere.
yeah, a sincere humbling like that's not going to just turn around just because the.
Well, the saint was able to perceive that it wasn't.
Right.
Yes. Right.
So he was still alive because he was one of the people who St. Macarius tried to palm off the abbacy on.
Oh.
And you know, he was kind of the benefactor of the monastery since it
He
was
was.
his land that
He was.
Yeah.
the monastery was built upon. So
That doesn't make sense.
Okay. If St. Macarius makes the chalices, the discus, and the plates on a lathe.
These are wood.
It must have been wood.
Yeah.
It reminds me of St. Innocent when he was bishop in Alaska. He made a lot of stuff by hand, not always just church things. But these guys they are quite competent at making a life in the wilderness.
Yep.
Where do you get the lathe?
might have made that too,
You could make a lathe.
There you go.
Probably water powered,
or foot powered.
Foot power.
Yeah, it doesn't say, but yeah.
yeah.
It wasn't electric.
In the 15th century, where do you go to buy a lathe?
You don't.
You don't make it.
You might go to the blacksmith to get some metal parts made.
Yeah.
Or you might go to the local woodworker or somebody to make it for you.
Right.
I read an account of these Russians that were gonna populate a place, and it's like this European wrote this depiction of it. They just had axes. They come to this area, they start clearing the trees, and the women start baking bread, and the men are. He was blown away at what they could do with an axe.
Remember
Some
that
people
picture
can really do fine
of
work
the
with an
wooden
axe.
Yeah.
I've
church
seen
we were
that.
looking at in your house? Tell them about that.
Oh, well, it's real beautiful.
What?
Made out of wood. It's a church in Russia. It's got maybe 20 or 30 of these onion domes on top
Yeah.
of it. It's all made out of wood and shingles. It's
Yeah.
just
Yes.
crazy, beautiful.
Wow.
And it was made without nails.
I didn't know that.
It's got pegs in it, and it was all done with axes and adzes and other hand tools.
Oh, yeah, this one.
Oh, wow.
I can pull a picture.
These people were
Craftsmen.
incredible
Yeah.
with their, that's it.
Yeah.
They were incredible with their
It's on an island too, I believe.
talents. Well, where it is now is not where it originally was.
Moved it.
The Soviets took it down and they moved it to make it a museum. So, let's see. When he died, by the way, at 83, so he's an old man, not like
Not like the other one.
a youth of 49. But then he wasn't a bishop either, so maybe that was helpful. And he lived a vigorous, clean life out in the wilderness, which is not the best way to get longevity, because it's a hard life out there too. They found heavy chains on him. What does that mean?
He was probably wearing them to, like,
Subdue the flesh.
The mortified
Exactly,
flesh.
yeah.
Saint Herman of Alaska wore a metal cross held with chains that were loops that were underneath his arms and over his shoulder. And he wore this under his garments. I think Saint Seraphim of Sorrow did the same.
I've seen that in an icon.
Isn't the monastic
Is that a monastic style?
when you become Stavrofor monk, there's a thing you wear under your.
Yeah, but that's mostly now, I mean, it's mostly a cloth.
Oh, okay.
Wearing chains is, I mean, you said it, it's to subdue the flesh. And
Right.
it's a podvig, it's a struggle.
It's a struggle you put on yourself.
But it's done secretly, so that
Right.
people aren't, oh, he's holy because he's wearing chains. Now, maybe they could hear them, I don't know.
Yeah, how would you keep from rattling when you walk, when you move?
If it's tightly bound, then it wouldn't rattle.
If you do it
Mhm.
properly, it won't rattle.
The other thing that, where have you heard other saints doing it? Wild animals come up to them to be fed.
Although Saint Seraphim did.
Saint Seraphim,
Seraph.
out in the deserts in Palestine, there,
Geronimo.
St. Herman.
Saint Herman,
Well, Saint Mary of Egypt, the
Saint Mary.
lion
The lion.
dug her grave.
Mhm.
Which desert father had the lion for a pet?
Gerasimmo or
Yeah.
Geronimo?
There were a couple of them actually.
Gerasimos.
Gerasimos.
And then Daniel.
Mhm.
There you go.
St. Thomas.
Okay, what else? We're running out of time. One other thing, he is not a bishop. Most of the other wonder workers we've heard about are.
He's one of the. Yeah, that is interesting.
Think about that for a while. I'll leave you to contemplate
Think
it.
on that.
Yes. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on the saints?
I've never heard this, Saint Joseph and that icon, the Pechan Mother of God, Peschan. I've never heard of that. You look that up.
I haven't either.
Was that the one that was on the?
There are a lot of miracle working icons of the Mother of God.
It seems in Russia more than, I mean, I'm sure if, I just don't even know the histories of these other countries, but it's amazing how many of them there are.
Yeah. Yeah, they're all over Russia, or they were.
Yeah.
Okay, so we still have Catherine, Innocent, and John, who are the last ones in this list. anyone want to volunteer? Michael?
You went to volunteer, Michael?
I'm just asking if you wanted to volunteer.
Oh.
I volunteer, Michael.
To do all three of them?
No, just pick one.
I'll do John.
Okay. Anybody?
What's the feast day? What's the feast day for St. John?
I'll have to look that up. I
How
don't
do you
know.
know, if it's just John, how do you know how?
Wonder Worker of all Russia.
There's only one.
I have the, I looked him up, of course I left this at my paper at home. So I don't remember which John it is, but, he's Wonder Worker of all Russia.
He's the only John Wonderworker of all Russia.
Might be John Maximovich, I don't know, Metropolitan of,
The one we just heard.
Tobolsk, might be,
There's a John of Moscow who's a fool for Christ.
not him. These are the Wonder Workers of all Russia.
Wonderworker of all Russia.
Our fathers among the saints, the wonder workers of all Russia, Michael, Peter, Alexis, Jonah, Philip, Macarius, Demetrius, Mitrophon, Tikhon, Theodosius, Joseph, Peterin, Hermogen, Innocent, and John. And we've done all but Peterin, Innocent, and John.
Is this Saint Innocent of Moscow, of Alaska?
I think it might be. I'll have to double check.
Were we gonna have one of Mary or Sophia do something?
Oh, yes, well, let's see. I did promise them.
Well, sounds like we have two more.
Yeah, we can do, a saint of the day. Let's see. Today is,
I think that would be the 20th, Sunday's the 17th.
you're right. So let's do, the 20th of January, so let's see who's on that day. Oh, good one. Euthemius the Great. Even better, the martyrs Ina, Pina, and Rima,
Okay.
disciples of the apostle Andrew and Scythia.
You're gonna assign that to one of them?
I'll ask if they would care to present. Ina, Pina, and Rima. Yeah. It's always good to have where their names are. There's two or three instances where a group of saints are named together like that.
Mhm.
Saint Melisipos, and
Mm-hmm.
grandmother Neonila. I forget the third name.
I do too.
You just had it.
Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. I always like those.
And then there's I forget their names, but there's these 5 brothers who are all saints. And they're commemorated twice, once in May and once in, I think it's July. So, these are people, they're not necessarily wonder workers of all Russia, but they are curious because these people have a link to each other and they basically are finding their salvation together,
Mhm.
which is kind of nice.
Mhm.
Okay. Who wants to do, we need, if we do Ina, Pina, and Rima, that's 2 of them. Katerina or Innocent?
I can do innocent.
Okay.
And who's the other one?
Katerina. But I don't want to try to do 4, we're.
Three.
Well, we went a bit longer today than
Spell
we.
that name for me though.
Pitiri.
Yeah.
I am.
Three's enough to do them. There's more time to talk about them.
Well, this lists John Kronstadt as wonder worker of all Russia.
John of Kronstadt, could be him.
There's also John of Novgorod.
Also, we don't know which John. it is.
I'll look it up. Unfortunately, the list doesn't say, it doesn't give you their appellation, it
But
just
in
gives
that,
you.
but in that, they commemorate St. John of Kronstadt. in
Separate,
another-
so it's not
another
him.
Part of that petition.
Good thinking.
Right, yeah, so.
But he was a wonder worker of all Russia.
Yes.
I wonder if the wonder workers all Russia in that group are all more ancient. The ones we've
They all-
studied have
they all
been
seem
studied.
to be in
Some of
like
them are,
from
but then we heard a
13
couple
to
of them,
16.
well, St. Joseph was glorified in 1911.
But
Yeah.
But
his,
his wife was.
his life was.
His life was older, and it's the
Yeah.
same thing with.
They all seem to be in a similar
Yeah,
time
but
period.
they are considered wonder workers of all Russia, because even though before their formal glorification, there's veneration throughout all of Russia. And they're working miracles, which is what a wonder worker does.
Right.
So, yeah. John of Shanghai in San Francisco is a wonder worker, but he's not of all Russia. He's a wonder worker in America.
In America.
Okay, we should say our final prayer.
Okay.
Thou hast appeared today unto the whole world, and thy light, O Lord, hath been shined upon us, who with knowledge chant unto thee. Thou hast come, thou hast appeared, O light unapproachable. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy.